So one of the reasons why I like console gaming so much was of course the exclusive games, and in particular the games that were produced by Sony. Now Sony put a lot of money into their games and they seem to come up with some of the best, particularly during the PS3 and PS4 generations. So when I saw that Sony was starting to release these games onto the PC, I got super excited. That was until The Last of Us dropped. So for a while there, Sony were actually on a roll. When they were dropping their Sony exclusive games, particularly the Sony Studios games, they were being met by PC gamers with enthusiasm because those games would look beautiful and they would play brilliantly, pretty much on any hardware. A couple of good examples of this are Days Gone and Death Stranding, both AAA titles which are absolutely fantastic to play, and if you haven't played them, make sure you try them out because they're pretty good. Played fantastic on pretty much anything. Now when those games came out, I was actually running an RX 5700 XT and I could pretty much play them in 1440p with high settings and they run perfectly fine. But as time's gone on, it seems that the drops from Sony are starting to get a little bit worse, particularly when it comes to the PC. Now this may be down to a couple of things, particularly with the more modern releases actually being remasters more than just general ports, but it does mean they're getting a little bit of a bad name for it. And the worst one of course at the moment is currently The Last of Us Part 1. Now this game dropped recently and it was welcomed with open arms by the PC community until people started to play it, which is when they realised it performed awfully pretty much on any tech. Now we should have known this up front because when Naughty Dog dropped the system requirements for it, it was actually pretty high. Now I remember when they dropped these system requirements for it because they displayed a picture on Twitter and it did start some controversy between the community, particularly when you looked at the high end, so your ultra 4K graphics. We're talking about some of the most ridiculous pieces of hardware out there, all the way down to the lowest end, which was kind of still listing some of the more modern graphics cards, which was a little bit insane at the time because people have only just gone through a GPU crisis, so trying to get hold of anything modern was pretty difficult. So I wasn't really sure what they were expecting. Now because I loved that game back when it was originally released on the PS3, of course I wanted to get it for the PC, but when I saw those early reviews, I kind of held off for a few weeks. I did want to do a video on the game, particularly to have a look at the performance that it gave, especially now that some patches have actually gone out. But I wanted to avoid doing one of those videos where we kind of just pair the game with a minimum spec or pair the game with a Ryzen APU or something like that. I wanted to have a look at a list of Sony games in a more broader spectrum and see where they've actually gone wrong. To do that, I've chosen a selection of the more recent drops from Sony, from games such as Death Stranding and Days Gone, all the way up to the latest releases of Spider-Man Remastered and The Last of Us Part 1. And I've kind of pitted them against a specific graphics card to see how well they performed. The graphics card we chose for those tests was this. This is our AMD Radeon RX 6500 XT. And choosing this graphics card was no accident. If you look at the minimum requirements for The Last of Us Part 1, you will see that this graphics card is listed. The one we have here is our Sapphire Pulse. It is a pretty basic version and it only has 4GB of VRAM. So if anything is going to struggle, this card is going to be it. So let's take a look at some of the benchmarks we did and then we'll take a look at the results and see where things went wrong. Now, during our benchmarking, the issue with the more recent drops from Sony is pretty clear, and we could tell that through a number of the games there, not just The Last of Us Part 1. If we take a look at the results that we got, we could see that most games actually performed pretty well, nearing the 60 frames per second target, particularly when we're looking at 1080p high quality, but not quite getting there. And unfortunately, the issues were not just in the average frames per second. The issues that we saw were primarily in the 1% lows, and this caused us a number of issues across a number of those games. One of the best examples of that was God of War. The game run perfectly fine, getting an average of 56 frames per second, but it had terrible 1% lows all the way down to 23. And you could tell this in the game where we got a terrible experience, because when we were actually playing in 1080p high settings, we would get this awful stuttering as we tried to turn the character. It wasn't always, but it was enough to take away from the gameplay and make it a really bad experience. We did try to resolve this by using FSR in some of the titles, but we didn't actually get any kind of improvement on those 1% lows. We did see a slight increase in the average frames per second, but that's not the thing that's going to give you the playable experience. So we had to go for something else. So turning the settings down in every game to either a medium or original setting not only saw an increase in the average frames per second, but we also saw a great increase in those 1% lows, and all the stuttering across all the games where we had that kind of problem had gone away. Now, of course, The Last of Us Part 1 still struggled when it came to averages, and the 1% lows, even though they increased quite a lot, was still pretty low, but that game is extremely demanding, and of course the RX 6500 XT is pretty much going to show its weaknesses when we hit that title. Which leads us on to the issue in hand. The issue is not necessarily with the performance of the cards or the systems at all, it's actually down to the amount of VRAM that you have. This card is only a 4GB card, and as we saw in God of War, when we were running in a high preset, and that's with high textures running, we were near enough capping out at the 4GB. When that actually happened, the system would jolt and we would get a great big stuttering across the screen, and then it would suddenly clear up. And this is because the graphics card is trying to feed information from the CPU at that point. Dropping the settings down to a medium or original setting obviously drops the texture quality as well, which means we're not using as much VRAM as we was before, and the card can actually perform much better. So for those of you out there who are currently running on 4GB cards, you are going to kind of run into some of the issues when it comes to those Sony games. Now, Sony are dropping, or at least Naughty Dog in the case of The Last of Us Part 1, are dropping patches to try and resolve some of these issues, and hopefully if they start to clean things up a little bit, they'll probably run a little bit smoother. But until then, what you need to do is start dropping those settings. You can pretty much leave most of the settings up if you want to customize them instead of using a preset like we did, but just drop your texture level down a little bit, and that way your card will be able to survive. We did do some testing with an 8GB card, and that was the RX 6600, and it didn't have any of the issues that this card kind of had, which kind of shows that it is the VRAM in the issue, because that card is an 8GB. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the Sony ports so far. Have they done a good enough job to keep you wanting those games? Have you tried The Last of Us yet on your systems? And if you have, let us know what your experience is, as well as the systems you are using. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content, and we'll catch you in the next one.